get started talking about messaging. So we're going to start out with kind of, some of the basics of messaging. But so let's start out with really basic. What is messaging? And how I see it when I talk about progressive messaging is, yes, we're trying to support progressive causes and campaigns. We're trying to get the word out. Really, what you're trying to do is you're trying to sell that issue. You're trying to sell that policy, sell that candidate, get someone to get out there and vote for that candidate, or show up for something, or vote for a referendum, right? To be on the side of that, right? So that's kind of anything that kind of does that. And I always think of it as like really high quality marketing. We see Apple, we see Nike, we see people with these really intense campaigns that really attach to people. And what's wonderful about what we're doing is we are doing things to make lives better. So if we have those, if we message to that and how that positive change that's happening, we have the formula, like it's all there. We just have to find a better way of getting it out there. And it's very, very important because the way things are messaged and the way they're connecting with people, the way we're not making good laws to protect or even, pathways to citizenship, things like that are being blocked up. A lot of that can be accessed through good messaging. We can sell it to people so they understand it different. We can frame it in a way that people will go, oh, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing for myself personally, for my family, for everyone. So it's a very powerful tool and very important because you were talking about people's lives, people's access to healthcare, people's access to being able to get a job and pay their rent. So this is really important. If we have the right messaging, instead of reinforcing those negative narratives that we hear, we can really change those narratives and break them down. So what we're doing here is really good work. And we know it works because we understand, that if we have good messaging, we're going to connect and have those stories. We're going to have those connections with people, those emotional connections. It's going to break down those barriers. It's going to build those bridges, right, between people we think are kind of on the other side. So, that's very important. And once again, stressing that these messages can break down these narratives that are really preventing people from accessing things that are vitally important to the quality of their lives. So what really led me on this path was, we hear it all the time. Democrats are bad at messaging. We'll hear, oh, God, Democrats are so bad at messaging. Why do we always get it wrong? We have great policies. Why can't we connect it to people and get that emotive response that ready to go and charge in there? And then why is the GOP just so much better at it than we are? Well, historically, the GOP has just put a lot of resources behind it. They're very organized and they're very much a consensus getting. I like to say, progressives appreciate individuality. We appreciate this broad coalition of different cultures, of different economic status, of different just intellect, just all these different things that people bring to it make us richer and better, right? That's why we are the progressive group, right? So we can't focus our resources into kind of one or two things, right? Whereas the GOP, everything's about very controlled, structured, organized messaging, and get on the boat or you're off the boat and you're not invited in, kind of thing. And they're very consistent about it. They're very united about it. They're very organized. They have meetings where everyone can come in and get strict messaging. They put a lot of resources into it. They recruit people from very, very young through the think tanks, through universities and things like that. Not to say that we don't do that. We have our own, but they're kind of, I'd like to say they're kind of decades ahead of us with the game. And then there's also, you have to follow the messaging and be very strict. We don't allow, kind of falling off on that messaging and a myriad of different, attitudes and thoughts about things. So that can be a challenge for us. I'd say that that's one of the challenges, also a huge opportunity. That's how I always see it when something looks like a challenge. But the GOP has just very more practiced at it and they're very good at it. And when I talk about, their ability to connect with emotion and kind of trigger people up into action, and we do the same thing, we can do that in both a positive way too. What they're really doing is we're connecting with these frames with people. It's basically, people are kind of hardwired to have these responses to things based upon their experience, based upon, how they're raised, their family structures, things like that, what priorities are for them. And, one thing that how this works is we can almost like look at different family structures and how people tend to be more progressive and tend to be more kind of conservative. And where do these frames come from? Well, there's some great resources on understanding these a little deeper, great simple resources to read. But basically your frames are those structures that shape how you see the world. So when we think about certain things like freedom and immigration and things, what do those things mean to you? Well, they're based upon your experiences. They're based upon how you were brought up, how your culture, how your community, how your extended family believes about things, or your friendship groups, right? So this is basically how we see the world. And when we hear a word, frames can be activated. And the more it's activated, the more rooted it is, like feeding something, right? It becomes more rooted and stronger. So what's really important is when we're developing our messaging, we're not using the negative frames that are triggering these negative frames against us, like repeating messages that are very negative in order to counter. It's not a very good method. But to learn more about this, a couple books, great author, George Lakoff, scientist, has a amazing amount of work on this. Don't Think of an Elephant was kind of the one that started us off on this framing issue. And it really looks at like messaging and how framing things can really have that kind of impact. So I do recommend you investigate that more. But we'll be talking a lot about framing and how it has to do with messages. So I'd mentioned that when you have these frames, certain things are triggered when you talk about certain words, right? And you'll notice that certain words are repeated a lot in the GOP when they're saying things about Democrats, right? They use these same words kind of against us. And the worst thing we can be doing is using those words and repeating them and saying, oh, but they're so terrible, illegal immigration or whatever. And one of them that really gets my goat is this whole radical liberal talk that the GOP does. Well, and we'll talk a little bit about, just a quick example reference of some bad messaging, and then there's some better messaging. And bad messaging really means you're taking that negative frame, those negative words, and using them again and repeating them. In this message, we can see that we're using the term that they used. We're actually using this on our platform for Indiana Democrats. We're using it to broadcast it, to promote it, to amplify it, to feed this algorithm that's getting it farther and farther and farther out there. And it says liberal wish list. And there's that liberal word. So people aren't going to see all this other stuff. They're going to pick up on those words that attach to kind of these emotive frames, and radical liberal wish list, that kind of thing. And then also the fact that they're amplifying the GOP themselves. They're using our time and energy and resources, our platforms, to not only not talk about what Democrats are accomplishing. It's kind of like a byline, a secondary line there. People don't read things thoroughly. They skim them very quickly. So I've got a big picture of a GOP elected official with a link to an article that, great, it boosts that negative article that's not very good for us, but it's very good for them. So this is just kind of an example of things we want to watch out for and stay away from when we're talking about, like, not basically using our opponent's information, to say, but they called us liberal radical, this wish list. We're using it. They're just going to have an emotional response hearing that. They're not going to hear what we are really trying to get across, right? A little better, another, post basically in a very close period of time, they talked about how, and they hashtagged it, about Democrats deliberating about the American Rescue Plan. And they were more specific, like, here is an example of what Democrats are doing for you, right? We're not talking about, liberal wish lists. We're building rehab, treatment facilities, period. And I wouldn't call this like an A+. I might call it like a B or a B-. The thing that gets me is they are retagging this article, but people are just seeing curtains. And I really feel like they would have almost been better off substituting it with a picture from the graphics that are available for Build Back Better, or things like that, or even making up something that was more eye-catching. This kind of looks sad and bleak. People, if there's a picture, that is what they're going to look at first in a post, right? They're going to look at that picture. I think we've all gotten those political flyers with the flames and the devil's horns, about the candidate and how horrible they are. Well, you're spending your time and money and postage, basically putting that person's face in front of people. In that negative discourse, that's not how you win progressive voters over, that whole like horror, harms and horror kind of thing. That's not who we're trying to turn out to vote. I have to say, though, this over here is a little better when we talk about childcare for low-income families to creating union jobs. It's very specific, talks about childcare and jobs. I would have probably not talked dollars so much because there's that spending too much money. I would actually take the amounts out and just talk about what they're accomplishing specifically. If we're talking Indiana, we should be talking about Indiana roads and what roads are being rebuilt and what bridges are being rebuilt, what towns are going to see that money. Very, very specific. And that's one thing that we tend to do. We tend to be very broad in our messaging and talk about the dollars. Well, there's that whole reputation of Democrats spend too much money. We don't want to talk about the spending. We want to talk about the results of that. And we'll get into that a little more. I do like, and of course, Joe won the 2020 election, so there was some good messaging there. I do like when they're promoting, very simple bar graph kind of things. Job growth by president, we can see blue here is our Democrats, and then red is our Republicans. So you can kind of translate that down. Say you're working on like a local or even statewide kind of election. You want to keep things very localized. This, you can use the terms rescue plan, but make it very, very specific, even if it's just graphics or pictures of your town and things that are being done kind of thing. So I just wanted to give you kind of like what we're talking about when we're talking about like using words that trigger those frames, those negative frames. So basically, this is a Democrat like message. And it's, to me, this is going to make someone feel more that Democrats are liberal, which isn't a positive connotation. That's not a positive frame that we want to connect with. Whereas we want to connect with Democrats deliver, right? Democrats in jobs and childcare and things like that. Because that really, that is the foundation of kind of what we do. And we talked a little bit about the types of family structure. So if you get a chance to read George's book, a lot of it was like a light bulb for him. He's like, well, gosh, the GOP sounds like a conservative family, and the the Democrats, progressives, sound like the nurturant family, just more different. So we look at these kind of different structures, and you can see that there is kind of this translation into different politics, right? Progressives, equal authority, parents of equal authority, caring for each other, progressives caring for each other. So there is that, like, empathy is a big thing with progressives and Democrats, whereas conservatives with the more strict family household, there's a natural leader. Someone said, I alone can fix it, right? That was a great thing. One person to listen to. There's that authority. There's that, unity message, liberty, freedom from, that individual responsibility, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Whereas progressives are more like cooperation is necessary for a successful society, things like that. And so that we might see, where we're connecting, with those different kinds of frames, those which come from kind of that upbringing we're talking about. One way to kind of put this into practice is, the example of wealth, right? And we look at it as to what's the primary reason someone is successful, right? A progressive might look at it like, well, yeah, they worked hard, but you need opportunity too, right? You need to be given, that a lot of groups have more opportunity, and we need to make that fair so everybody can be successful, right? Whereas, on a more conservative view, it is they worked harder. That's why. If I just work hard enough, it's nothing about me opportunity, because I've never had to deal with those challenges. But if I just work hard, I can be successful. And if I'm not successful, it's because I didn't work hard enough. So that's how they tend to, there's these different kind of perspectives, these lenses through which a lot of people tend to look at success. I love to look at it in through the lens of freedom. And one thing I really loved about Pete, when he started his campaign, he really focused on these three tenets: freedom, security, and democracy. And as we've noticed these past few years, conservatives have really claimed the flag, freedom, patriot, those types of things. Well, as you know, so their frame, their view of freedom is more freedom from regulation. I can have my gun. My kids don't, schools aren't going to tell my kids, anything. They're not going to expose them to things that are bad for them. Whereas progressives see freedom as an opportunity. We see it as, if I have healthcare, then I can start a small business. Or I can live, right? If somebody can't carry a gun around, then I'm safe to go to Walmart. If my kids wear a mask, then we have the freedom to go to school and not be sick, right? So there's just that same kind of idea of freedom, but through two different lenses, right? That progressive lens and that conservative lens. But what's really interesting is by understanding that we can use words and language that connects the two things, we both have that shared value. And we'll get into talking about shared values, because we really believe here, I think Kaz in her studies and myself, we really feel like talking on shared values is that magic wand that's going to connect us all. And in between those, we might have people, we call them biconceptuals, or what we would call in election terms, the persuadables. These are the people that kind of carry both. And if we can connect with them and pull them over to our side and get them to understand that we're with them, and that, there's something that we offer that they agree with, we can get them to vote for us, right? So we want to have that conversation with them. So one example I like to bring up is elder care. Someone in a conservative family might say, yeah, but Medicare is my right and my grandparents should be taken care of and they should be protected. That's kind of a liberal thing, because that falls under the social net, the Medicare and Social Security and all those programs established where the government controls and regulates these things, and we're providing these services to people, right? We're giving, using their taxes or whatever they're paying into to kind of support them. But then they might be ultra conservative about Second Amendment rights. Absolutely no regulation. Don't want anybody coming into my house and telling me what to do, right? So they're kind of like on that swing voter thing. We can find, we share that in common. Let's talk about more of what we share in common. Or we could talk about with the framing of freedom and say, hey, yeah, I want the freedom too for, I want the freedom for my kids to be safe. Or if somebody has a gun in a store, then I know that that person is trained or been background checked or something like that, right? So we can find these things where we're common, and the goal really is to connect on those shared values, to find what we have in common. And so there is that whole emotional connection to things. And I think we can see it. We've seen it in our friends and family. There's a triggering that occurs. Trigger is a big word in the past few years on both sides. And we're looking to evoke that emotion, because emotion is that frame, and it's going to be deep, and it's going to sustain itself, and it's going to get that person to take action for you or donate or support you. And basically how the GOP has really been working is what I call harms and horrors. It's a harms and horrors narrative where they use words like radical and socialist, illegal, aliens, invasion at the border. I'm still hearing these things, right? Critical race theories. So they're really good at branding and messaging to attach to those those frames really deep down about liberty and freedom and authority and things, and rule of law and all those good things, right? Whereas what works for us as progressives and works really well, worked in 2020, was connecting with those positive frames, right? When Joe talked about the soul of the nation and leadership and build back better. Obama won 2 elections and he won Indiana on hope. Hope was a shared value. He could get everyone to be united on being hopeful, on hope. So there is a way that, if we message it in our way, we don't want to change who we are. We want to just really talk better about that and connecting on those shared values. So I always like to say there's kind of an art of messaging. There's kind of, steps you can take, things you should look for. Most importantly, you have to make your messaging very, very simple. Lots of numbers, lots of big words, lots of lingos, lots of acronyms. You're not talking to people like us that are engaged enough to sit here for an hour on a Thursday night or Google something, or kind of, we are political hobbyists, we are activists, so we pay attention to these things. We are really trying to talk to, the person on the street, a family member, someone who's not really thinking about how politics steps into their lives every day, right? And that's a big discussion I have with people about how local politics really steps into their lives when we're talking about getting out the vote kind of thing. Because they're like, and you say politics and it's been so negative. So we really have to have strong, positive messaging that really talks about why we're here and why it's important and really how it affects your life. So keeping it really simple, making sure you're connecting on those shared values you have with people, and always being authentic to yourself, no matter what it is, and just stick to your progressive values. That is what's going to win, not anti something else. We don't have a Trump this year, so it's going to have to be about what we've accomplished. And a lot of people have no clue what this has actually done for their lives and how Build Back Better or the rescue plan, or even what Biden's doing right now with the Ukraine and the way he's approaching it and things like that. They don't understand why this affects their everyday. So it's really important to be very authentic and to stick to those progressive values. Because what we tend to do a lot of times, if we're not speaking in values, if we're not speaking simply, we'll talk policy because we do our homework. Progressives, Democrats, legislative, Congress people, they do their homework. We know our stuff and the stuff is good, but there's a lot of numbers and it's about policy. And when we talk about facts and policy, they're just not going to get through. They don't have that emotive response, that like triggery response, right? If you notice, the Republicans don't talk about numbers. They just use broad terms like liberal spending or radical liberal or invasion at the border. They just use these very emotive words, right? They can be lazy. They don't have to back anything up. But progressives do. So we really have to learn to speak in values. And I talk a lot now about translating for people what those policies are doing every day for them, because people aren't making that step. They're not thinking through what is that going to do for me when they hear about how much money is being spent on infrastructure. They don't make, so we need to bring it down and simplify it, funnel it to them. And that's our job. If we really want to affect change, then we need to be good at that and to practice that. As Anat Shanker-Osorio, who Googler, she's fantastic. If there's any opportunity to watch a YouTube video or join any kind of live stream she's on, she's wonderful. She has a really good term. We need to sell the brownie, not the recipe. And I like to say, when you go into the bakery, you look and you smell that delicious brownie. You smell all those wonderful baked goods. You see the wonderful baked goods. You don't ask them what ingredients they put in it. You might ask them what an allergen is or something, but you're not saying how much butter, how much sugar, how much time did it take you to make it? How much money did you spend to make the brownie? You just want the brownie. And that's what we need to do. We need to sell that delicious brownie to people when we talk about things. So we have to think in a more enticing, simple way, right? So let's take, for instance, when people talk about the minimum wage, we just keep on saying the minimum wage should be $15 an hour. Well, what does $15 mean to people? We might use it in a work frame. So we talk about dry topics like family leave and, that kind of thing. It's kind of not very sexy and not very exciting, right? Whereas if we take the time to bring it to a human frame and help people, guide people, have that conversation, message it to the human frame, that means dad makes enough money to feed his kids, dad makes enough money or mom makes enough money to have reasonable work hours, grandma is taken care of, whether it's through a minimum wage or her caregivers are better qualified and she or he are safer, things like that, babies. So we really want to talk in those warm and fuzzy, babies, life, food, time at home, time with family kind of perspective, right? Bring it to people on a very basic level. And also educate. When we talk about, a lot of Democratic organizations, it's very easy to just grab kind of national talk, the American Rescue Plan, what Democrats are doing on a national level, because they don't have the resources to figure out good messaging for their like local group in like Carmel, Indiana. But you do need to do that, because people are hearing a lot. If we focused on national politics, it's kind of nasty. There's some tricky players. It's kind of like watching The Bachelor, White House Bachelor. It's all, you know, people that make the most annoying noise get the most attention. That is what people think of politics now. What they're not thinking is that politics is putting roads in, schools in, you know, getting people back to work after COVID, building bridges, you know, that kind of thing. So you have to know your audience, listen to what they're telling you is really, really important to them, and message to that, incorporate that and funnel it down to that exact thing that they're really, really kind of excited, concerned. Because when we call voters, we say, what's been on your mind lately? And when I would talk to voters in Georgia, they were like, well, my kid's still here. And I'm like, yeah, let's get your kids back to work. If we can get Warnock and Ossoff into office, then we can get your kids back to school, and you can go to work and things like that. So you have to simplify it down. We can't just keep it so broad like we tend to. Kaz likes to call it living room issues. And she likes to say, if Joe Biden's not walking through your living room, you don't talk about Joe Biden, because you have to talk about living room issues. They have to connect with local things that are going on. And you have to know, you have to read the op-eds in your paper. You have to look through Facebook groups. You have to have conversations with people. What is it that they're thinking about? What is that's important to them? What is going to improve their life? That kind of thing. You have to be very specific. And we cannot have enough people doing this, because you could have great messaging, which the White House, in my opinion, does, but it's not getting enough to people. And there's a lot of disinformation in there, where people, I'll talk to them and I'll be like, that's what you think's going on? Like they don't have the time and energy to really absorb it. When we talk simple, here's some examples of some simple messaging that I really appreciated. Joe had taken Pete's rules of the road, and he just came out with Joe's rules, like basic value statement: empathy, humility, inclusion, dignity, joy, those things, right? When we talk about our series, we were going to call it a million things, but we went really simple and called it Real Talk, because it's a real talk about things. We did a great series for Indiana for Joe Biden. We called it Fair Shot for Indiana. So it was Biden's fair shot for Indiana. Terry had some research. She knew fairness was really, really important to Hoosiers. So basketball is a big play on that. That's a big thing here in Indiana. So we really used the kind of that graphic, and that kind of thing. So pare it down. Look at what you're putting together for your candidate or your cause, or literature you're putting together, and really, really simplify it down. For instance, when we talk about infrastructure, we get a lot of imagery with infrastructure, right? They'll say union jobs, which most people translate to high-paying jobs. They'll talk about trains. There's a lot of talk about bridges, because I guess that's been a major issue for decades. If you notice, they're talking a lot about trucking. So these are real, middle class things that people are dealing with on a daily basis. When the bridge between Indiana and Kentucky is closed for 2 years, or it's down to one lane for a long period of time, and people are fighting that traffic, right? So they're trying to make those connections to your everyday lives. So when you're speaking and messaging to people, keep it really, really local. Joe did some great with keeping it simple. We will restore dignity was a whole series he came out with, where he was attaching it to like a value. So we will restore dignity. We will restore, these things to America, all of us. Hope over fear, unity over division, truth over lies. So that was a really good kind of simple messaging that he did. And once again, cannot stress enough, you have to find those shared values. What is common for both sides? Freedom is very common, right? Feeding families, jobs, things like that, right? And using statements like, we can all agree, right? But really it comes to starting to listen, because people aren't expecting you to listen and then understand what they're saying and use that in your messaging. So what you're doing is you're already finding the magic sauce, that magic button you need to push when you've listened to people enough to what they're doing. One of our sessions, we did a analysis of the House races that were, back in 2020, the ones that we lost, and it looked at the messaging. And what happened is everybody was messaging to these top three things that were not the top three things in people's minds. The one out of the three maybe was like, jobs, and the others was talking about Nancy Pelosi and Trump and insurance benefits and things like that. And they didn't take the time to actively connect and find out what people needed to know and how we needed to message to them. So it's really important to do that. Build that trust through vulnerability. We always think of vulnerability as a weakness. That's a GOP opinion, right? But here, Joe's a very sensitive guy, and empathy is really, really important. And we can talk about, this is my life experience and your life experience. That is a shared experience we've had. Whether it's a medical issue or something like that, we can find those connections with those. And once again, I can't stress enough, be authentic. Don't give up on that. So this was something that came up a few weeks ago that I thought was really interesting to share. And I did get some positive feedback on it when we presented it in our last session. Is, one side is Democrats, the other is our kind of opposition, or we could say GOP. And what are these shared values within these groups? Equality within the Democrats is important. Freedom within the opposition, the conservatives, is very, very important. So these are kind of showing those. And then the identities, how do Democrats identify? They use class and race and health, kind of a shared thing, versus, the more conservative. What's really interesting are some of the priorities that we do have in common. So we can speak about these to our, people we're trying to persuade or bring in, kind of thing, because we do share a concern about the cost of living, right? And things like that. So I kind of highlighted the two main big areas that we kind of had this connection with. And corruption is a big on both sides, whether it's corruption from elected officials or it's corruption from the ultra wealthy, right? That value is we do fairness and we want to fight corruption. So we can use that and use the messaging to approach it from there. So we want to trigger that connection between those two sides. Make sure that our Democrats turn out for us, but make sure that the opposition also looks at us and goes, oh, well, yeah, they're fighting corruption too, kind of thing. So one way we can really kind of do this is we have that, understanding we have that shared value. So really, it's almost formulaic when you kind of look at it, is we can talk about what we agree on with statements like we can agree, right? Or most of us believe. These are statements that we can all have. But then there's the problem. Politicians trying to divide us, the wealthy corruption, things like that, a powerful few who are using us against each other. Acknowledging that there is a division, but it's being manufactured for us. It's being used against us, kind of wisening up to the manipulation that's kind of occurring. I agree there's division, but it's not you and me that's causing it. There's an outside force that's coming in here and creating this wedge. And they call it the faction. And that's like a faction of people that have created this disinformation about the campaign. And they want to keep things riled up right now. So acknowledging that shared value, acknowledging that there's something there that's trying to divide us, that something other than us are going to benefit from, and then talking about the solution. So join us or come together, picking leaders who will provide, contracts to union workers or build that bridge or get that pothole filled, right? So it's kind of formulaic there. We also call it the messaging sandwich. You have the shared value, the problem, and then the solve together, and they make this really good kind of delicious sandwich that we can all appreciate together. I wanted to show this because this was someone who ran very close to me for the Indiana State House here. And he tells his story. He talks about his values. There's the term hard work before everything else. His first job, talking about his story, his vulnerability, you can kind of connect with him as a human. So I thought this messaging was pretty solid and very, very easy to interpret. You've got your fairness, balance, and unity, right? And how he's going to achieve those things. So I really appreciated it. He won his election. And he is still out there representing us very, very well. So I would not be surprised if he doesn't get reelected, because he's really keeping that messaging out there for people. But very simple, kind of basic. And isn't it funny that we see that word fairness? So he must have looked at the same research that Terry looked at 2 years ago, and fairness is there. So he got onto something. So, but I really like the simple graphics to this, and the simple kind of that fairness, balance, and unity. It's kind of almost like, very value focused. Some place that we went awry, this recent governorship election in Virginia. And, basically Terry focused on a national platform. He was all about bringing in Biden and Obama and everybody else and talking about anti-Trump in an election where we were past it. We were past 2020. And we weren't talking about he was a great governor and what he did for the state of Virginia and all these things, and the fact that we had a majority in Virginia and all these fantastic things that got passed because we had that. We could really get a lot of good work done, right? Whereas, the winner came through Youngkin, and he talked about CRT and school boards and very, very local issues. And we happened to know people that were on the ground canvassing before the election, and she was like, they're bombing it. They're talking about national issues on the Democratic side, and they're not talking about people. And we knew it as soon as weeks before the election actually came. We're like, this isn't gonna work. So that was an example of not so great, right? But it's really, it's intimidating, because if we really got the word out about how great what we accomplished, if we were good at selling it and messaging it, we would win. And I like to say there's more Democrats out there than there are Republicans. So it's just a matter of getting people, the messaging to the people that they need to do these things, they need to show up and vote, and they need to support our candidates, because we will continue to do great work for them. So some strategic recommendations going forward. Remember, we are the party that cares for all Americans. We don't look at Americans as red or blue. We care for all Americans. And that story of how helping and looking out for each of us helps all of us, right? If we care for people in our community, we're going to have lower crime rates. Our police officers are going to be safer. Our kids are going to have more opportunities, that kind of thing. And, we have candidates that actually represent our communities. It's not just one type of candidates, that aren't bought. They're real people that live in these communities. And that, we have policies that have created, Joe would talk about creating the middle class. We have, we provide policies so families can survive and thrive, right? And, Republicans fight against that, against making, having a family affordable. If we had services for people, we would have lower, pro-choice wouldn't be so much an issue, because we would provide services so people felt confident having families and that they could provide for them. And, we are the party of hope. Obama went on it for many, many years. He went on it. We believe that the world will be a better place if we just work at it, right? So we talk about, all Americans, all types of Americans, and how America is a better place because of who we have here. And yes, specifically frame it how it impacts people's daily lives, financially, rather than the overall dollar investment, right? We want to talk about literal $5 in your pocket kind of thing, not $600 million spent kind of thing. And then, when we talk about people that aren't super strong about Biden right now, we really, need to work on communicating more messages to them about, what we have accomplished. I love to talk about freedom, because I think this is a really big key, especially when we talk about voters' rights and what's happening with Ukraine right now. Freedom is really something we couldn't do what we do if we didn't have freedom too. And that's covered in healthcare. That's covered in having jobs and enough money to feed yourselves. That all for me falls under that umbrella of freedom. And as you notice, that's a connection that we kind of all share. The vaccine is what makes us free to go to work. The child tax credit is freedom. So families can take care of their children, and low cost prescription drugs. Oh my goodness, that is, even Joe had a young boy at the State of the Union talking about insulin costs and how, what kind of freedom is it when you're paying $1,000 a month for insulin costs, for insulin, that kind of thing. So really focusing on, we are the party that cares for all Americans. We have helped build this middle class. What our policies do is focused on, opportunity for everyone to achieve, that hopeful vision of the future, and talking about, the freedom too. That's what we're looking to do. When you develop your messaging, you're on a campaign, you're like, okay, this is kind of going to be our messaging platform. These are the values we're going to focus on. This is how, this is our audience. You've done your research. Check it out. Run it through a SWOT analysis. Look at its strengths. Look at its weaknesses. Put it on the whiteboard kind of thing. Look at the opportunities for growth within that messaging, to kind of go out to other things. And what are the threats coming from maybe your opposition that can come in and compete? So I always say, test your messaging before you spend the time, money, and energy having people talk about it, or putting money behind it in prints, or putting it on a website or things like that. Run it by other people. We recently had someone who said, hey, I'm working on this campaign. What do you think of this website and messaging and stuff? And we were like, it's awful. And let people tell you what they think about it, because it's not about you being happy with it. It's about, is that message going to be received? So constructive criticism is great, because you want to do that before you spend time and resources in putting it out there. In the workbook, we kind of have a page for this too, just thinking it through, walk through that process. So just to kind of review the basics a bit when messaging is, use your own language. Never repeat the opponents, right? So we don't want to talk about illegal aliens and using those terms and phrases. We don't want to embed them deeper into people, those negative messages. Know your beliefs. So sit down with your candidate, sit down with your organization. What are those values and beliefs that you believe in? Come up with a missions and values statement, and just have a couple values: belonging, inclusion, whatever they mean to you. Fairness is really important to me personally. Have those discussions before you start the messaging, because you're really going to want to root your messaging into the values that are really important. And you're going to repeat this stuff over and over again. People aren't going to hear it one time or two times. So consistent messaging that really attaches to, simple, attaches to the same values kind of thing. And never repeat those ideas from your opponent. I remember there was the debate in Georgia, and I can't remember her name now, but she was, Ossoff won. All she kept repeating was the same phrase over and over again: radical Democrat, radical liberal. Literally, I think she had an earpiece in, and they were just telling her to say that whenever she was waiting for them to respond and give her an answer. And he never once said it. He never once said in the debate, repeated radical liberal. He didn't take the bait and say, I'm not a radical liberal. We like to say, it's a lot like Nixon, I'm not a crook. Well, someone has to tell you they're not a crook. They probably are a crook, right? So we have to be careful not to repeat those ideas, because we're reinforcing those negative frames. And even if it's the material that you're using to defend or argue with them, be positive, and just talk about, hope and change and what we've accomplished and what we're going to accomplish. Because I like to say, I got 99 problems and I don't want one more. I don't want the doom and gloom. I don't want to hear how this candidate's going to burn the house down. But we can override that with being positive, being authentic, using imagery, tell stories, paint pictures in what you do, show them what it's going to look like with the policies that we're putting in place. Pictures of babies, not pictures of curtained, speaking podiums kind of thing. Really show them what it's going to be, and always look back at what you're working on and say, could we make this simpler and more basic? And cannot stress enough, put your story in your messaging. Tell the story of what you are.